Good morning. Here it is in mid-July, and we're in midsummer, and yet we're isolated in our homes. This is a strange year. Normally in summer, we would be out having fun, maybe gathering with family and friends, maybe taking a vacation, just doing a lot of fun things. And yet here we are, probably isolated in our homes. It is a strange time. Today, we're forced in isolation. Now, how do we feel about that? We're forced to relax. But for some of us, it may be stress because we're trying to figure out how to work from home, or our children may be home. We may be even teaching them as teachers, trying to figure out how to shop and get groceries without being infected. All of these different new things. So it could be a very stressful time rather than a relaxing time. We have to think about distancing rules, what's clean, what's not, and wearing a mask, washing our hands, all these things. So how might the Buddha Dharma help us in this situation? Buddhism is about waking up to what is true and real. Now, it's not a petition to have the world work to the way we want. It is that we develop our minds to fit in our conditions and how to respond to that. Now, San Diego is a beach town. We have an ocean, and we can go out to the beach. We see the waves, we see surfers coming in. Now, when waves come in, they have to go out. And the way that happens, it's called a riptide. And it's not really visible, but the waves that come in form a current that goes out to the ocean. Now just think if we were on a float, enjoying ourselves in the ocean, just floating around. And then suddenly we find ourselves going out to sea in one of these rip currents. What do? We're concerned. We didn't know it was here, but now we are on a rip current going out to sea. Now this is what could be happening now. We have several rip currents occurring in our lives. The most obvious one is COVID-19. We have a virus that is unseen. We don't know who has it. We don't know if we have it, but it's affecting our lives. Now, this has been with us for over 4 months. This is about 130 days. And we know that over 130,000 Americans have died. That works out to about 1,000 deaths a day. Now, 9/11 was a tragedy, a catastrophe. Over 3,000 people died. And now we have 3,000 people dying every 3 days. This is really a catastrophe. What do we do about it? There's another rip current that we may not see very much. This is the Black Lives Matter movement. Something has been going on for over 400 years, and we're now just becoming aware of some of these things. Slaves were brought over from Africa over 400 years ago, of course, against their will. They were the backbone of people who farmed and built many things in America. Also true of the Native Americans and some from the people from the South. But the slaves were made to build things and work for others. The thought of a person, a human, owning another person is, at this point, inconceivable, and yet that happened. And then, fortunately, just over 150 years ago, because of the Civil War, the slaves were freed. They were emancipated. And yet, things didn't change that much. We had the Jim Crow laws, segregation, laws which place the African American in an inferior position in housing, in many, many aspects of life. And it wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1960s that things began to change, that laws were changed. But even if the laws were changed, many things in our society did not. Things kind of went underground, and this is where, again, like a rip current, it was not seen because it became kind of an industrial complex in that racism was institutionalized. It was hidden. And it was because of the TV evening news in the 1960s that we saw what the conditions were in the Deep South, how people were treated with dogs, fire hoses, we saw lynchings. All these terrible things were going on, and we were unaware of it. But we became aware of it because of the television news coverage. Martin Luther King and many others who risked their lives, who gave their lives for this movement. And more recently, because of the video of the killing of George Floyd, over 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we see how casually a policeman killed him. And also it brought to mind all the many things that are happening, that this goes on every day, that again we were unaware of. This is what we might call institutional injustice. We had these things progress from slavery to Jim Crow to the civil rights movement to today, and yet still discrimination in housing, education, business, many aspects of life. To give you an example of the difference of one of these, just one, cocaine, when used in a powdered form, which is apparently used by, let's say, middle-class people, there's a penalty. But crack cocaine, another form, is used by many people of the lower incomes. And the penalties for these are often 10 times greater than for powdered cocaine. And of course, the users of crack cocaine, these are people of lower income, the black and brown people. And so we see this inconsistency. We also find out that when men are incarcerated, and I think it's almost like one in every male, black male, might be incarcerated during his life. But we see that prisons are now for profit, that in order to house people, prisons are now on a for-profit basis, and anything made for profit means that you need more of that thing, and that thing are prisoners. And so the system supports the prison system. So again, it's very unseen. Now, it goes on for many areas of life. We in the Japanese American community, and this temple is built basically from the Japanese American community, we experienced the incarceration during World War II. And we are the subjects of this, and so we have experienced firsthand, as many people of color have. And even without being a person of color, women have been placed in an inferior position. And it's only been 100 years next month that they will have gained the right to vote. And yet we have no significant leader, no woman president yet. And yet many other countries in Europe have women as their primary leader. So again, these are unseen things like a rip current. Now there's a third rip current, climate change, global warming. There's actually some evidence of this, but it's a little more subtle. We seem to ignore this, except that there seem to be more hurricanes, fires are more intense. Scientists tell us the ice is melting in the Arctic, seawater is rising. We have all these indications, and yet we seem blind to it. We say that it's not seen. This affects our children and the whole future. How does it affect us? Again, are we waking up? So how can the Buddha Dharma help us? All of us, we're in different positions. How do we wake up to all these things, just like the rip currents that are unseen? Now, what has Shinran talked about? He talked about a crosswise leap, to wake up, to see life from a different perspective. So if you find yourself in a rip current, you do not swim across against the current and swim towards shore. What you do is you swim crosswise, parallel to the beach, until you get out of the current. And so that without being in that current going out to sea, you can swim back. So there is something we can do, and we should think of this in these other factors in our social life. Now, the Shin practice, what is that? Is that we are practicing not to achieve anything. We don't want the world to shift in our favor, but we realize that we have to shift our thinking, our minds, and find solutions that is harmonious with many other things. And so we have the Nembutsu, gratitude, having this crosswise shift, seeing things from another perspective. But I think there's another step once we say thank you, and that is an action to demonstrate that we have really heard that we are waking up. Vasubandhu, our second patriarch, wrote something called Jodo-ron, and in it he talks about stages and practices of a bodhisattva. And he has 5 stages. They include worship, praise, aspiration, contemplation, and the last phase, which is kind of analogous to receiving merit and being somewhat awakened. He calls that last stage playing in the garden. And what that indicates is that what we do when we wake up is we go back out and we help others. And it's like playing in the garden. It's not work. It's not something we have to do, but it's an indication that we are awake. And so I think, along with Reverend Greg Gibbs, that as we progress as Shin Buddhists, we don't remain just totally ignorant. There is some progress. We're not quite Buddhists, but we're not quite as ignorant as when we started. Yes, we do things and they're flawed, they're imperfect, but we're helping others. Now, let's look at some examples of how we might swim crosswise in these rip currents that are affecting our lives. For COVID-19, one of the paramitas is patience, and we're being patient. And I think the Sangha, the San Diego Sangha, has been very successful in staying at home, even though it's been difficult without, our physically meeting with our friends and family. We've done that. And so we're not adding to this. So actually, doing nothing is doing something. And we think of the Zen, the saying that the Zen tell us, don't do something, do nothing, sit. Now these are wise words, because instead of jumping in and doing something that's probably shallow and just done something without much thought, we might sit and contemplate and think about a solution that would be very helpful on a deeper level. So there are things we can do. Now, in our isolation, people are doing things in our Sangha. They're making masks. They're thinking of ways of fundraising. We can think of the situation when we were with people and our connection with others becomes more valuable, and we think of the time when we can connect with each other, and then it would be more cherished and more valued. We might be even making phone calls to others who don't have computers. So there are things we can do in this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what about the Black Lives Matter movement? Now, it's more specifically about police brutality and the unnecessary killing of black men and women, and the racial profiling for just driving or doing things that many of us do without thinking of the hazards. But for the African American men especially, this is a dangerous thing when you're pulled over by the police. So what can we do there? That's been a topic of our Buddhism 1, 2, 3 class this last Wednesday. And one of the requests I made was to come back with different ideas of what we might do individually. And it doesn't have to be a big thing, but something small. And what's come out of that first discussion was that we might first listen to people who are African American, to see what their lives are about, to see what has been revealed in some of the interviews on television on the ordinary life of an African American and the dangers they face just in going out shopping and doing things. I've asked Kamar Bradford to give us a Dharma talk in August. I've also connected with the AME church in our neighborhood to talk with Reverend Vaughn to see how we might help in this activity. So there are things we can do, and mainly it's to listen and then to respond in a way that is helpful. Now this will be on a very deep level, And so it will take time. But what we can do is just listen. And part of that is that you can join in our Buddhism 123. We have it Wednesday nights from 7 to 8:30. Bill might put on a link so that you will know how to join it. And you don't have to talk, but you can listen to the conversation of about 25 people, many from outside of San Diego, from far away as Philadelphia, Salt Lake City, Hawaii. But anyway, just to hear the different viewpoints of many people. And this is something we can do. So think of what we might do as individuals in this Black Lives Matter, because this will take a while. It means shifting our thinking, shifting from the way things have been to make very deep changes. And it's difficult because it's changing people's minds and attitudes. And so it will take a while. The third rip current I talked about was global warming. Fortunately, we have Roger Kopak, who will help us next week as we talk about that. In this situation, we often hear the term kodomo no tame ni, for the sake of the children. Now, global warming really is for the sake of the children. I may not be around that much longer, and so I may not really experience the effects of the horrendous effects that this global happening. But our children and grandchildren will. And so we need to think whether we can forego some usual comforts that we have so that they may have a better life. Just the things we take for granted, the way we travel in our cars, the way we heat and cool our homes, and all these things. But central to all of these things is the Buddha's teaching. Yes, these are the effects, but then they're the effect of what? The second Noble Truth tells us. Whenever we see ignorance, hatred, and greed, it's an indication that someone will suffer. And so it is this ignorance that we could work on, and it's to inform others. What we can do is inform our family and friends of the things that we see in this rip current. If we were caught in a rip current, we would be telling our friends and family, don't go to that area. And so it is important for us to inform those who are close to us about these factors. So all these things are very long-term and deep. Perhaps the COVID-19 pandemic might be the easiest thing, but the Black Lives Matter, global warming, will take a long time. It takes a while for people to mature, for people to change their minds, to people to see that we, each of us, are involved and have caused this. Now, I am advocating the practice, but again, this practice is not to achieve anything. It's to become aware and to show that we have heard. Now, we can say, yes, I shift from please to thank you, and I say thank you. But is that enough? Have we really heard? For an example, I'm not real neat as far as papers and books, and so they're scattered all around our living area. And Karen has asked me, please clean that up. And I say, yes, I hear you, I hear you. And then I don't do anything. The paper and books are still all over. Have I heard her? No, I haven't. And so when we say thank you, that we hear the teachings of the Buddha, that we hear and see what the rip currents are doing, have we really heard? It is if we can do something about this in our small or big way that we really show that we have heard. And so the thank you has this following step of demonstrating with the practice of bringing harmony to all that will show that we have heard the teachings of the Buddha and we are implementing in helping our lives and the lives of others really go forward in harmony. So please join me in expressing our deepest sense of appreciation for all that we have and that we might take part in awakening all others out of ignorance into wisdom and compassion. Gassho, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda, Namanda. Thank you.